Okay, good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the Real Thomas Jefferson. I am Dr. Richard Bellato, a chemist by training, but an enthusiast of American history, especially of Thomas Jefferson. The aim of this show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, to revisit and revise the revisionists, who are ever in the business of deconstructing Jefferson's prose, that is, his letters, addresses, memos, etc. Nearly all Jeffersonian biographers today take it upon themselves to write of Jefferson's Janus facedness. What Jefferson says most often cannot be understood literally. His prose must be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. It is commonplace to call the man a hypocrite and even a contradiction. This show then aims to dispel that myth. Jefferson can be known, and logic, not intuitive and discretionary deconstruction, is the method. As always, I am joined by Dr. Holachak, a professor of philosophy and history, who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University Camden. He is author and editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and has published over 300 essays, formal and informal, and 30 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes about Ukraine.
Well, we have with us today Professor Bob Turner. He and I were at Hanover Tavern, Hanover, Virginia, a few weeks ago speaking on Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, and Jefferson and Race. Professor Turner contributed 2 talks. I've contributed the intro talk, and he had the main essay. And I think we did a really nice job of covering this. And today, Professor Robert Turner is going to talk with us about his Scholars Commission report. I want to emphasize that we're just going to give you a taste of what he's doing, his motivation, the reception, and we'll have him on in future episodes to go into greater detail because he has a wealth of details in this wonderful book of his. So, Rich, why don't you start us off?
Sure. It is a real honor to have you with us today, Professor Turner. You have an impressive and accomplished resume in government, specializing in international law and national security law. Beginning with Dr. Turner is a Vietnam veteran, having served as an Army captain in gathering intelligence by interviewing communist defectors and prisoners, an attorney at law, professor of international law at University of Virginia, emeritus, and co-founder of University of Virginia Center for National Security Law. Your career elliptically has focused on the grand scale legal aspects of our country's national security. Professor Turner, you are peculiarly qualified to have analyzed the Jefferson-Hemings paternity controversy. Let's begin by me asking you why you became interested in the project.
Well, I first got interested in Jefferson more than 50 years ago when after I got back from Vietnam, I took a position at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I was in the university bookstore and picked up a volume on the complete writings of Lincoln and the selected writings of Jefferson. And a few weeks later, I couldn't get to sleep. I was laying in bed trying to sleep. I opened up my eyes. I saw the Jefferson book and the bookshelf next to me, and I said, that'll put me to sleep, and I picked it up.
Was that Peterson's book?
No, this was the modern library edition of the. It was a collection of selected writings of Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, at 5 a.m, I'm still underlining. It was like a religious experience. I just fell in love with the man, his mind. It was just brilliant. And a few years later, I was working in the Senate in Washington, and I was in Georgetown, and they had a 20-volume set of Jefferson's papers, missing volume 19 for $125. I took several trips to carry them to my car, but I started reading them. I got more hooked, and ultimately I've got at least one set of every multi-volume collection of Jefferson's papers, and have just been a big Jefferson fan for over 50 years. And I was approached about taking part in what was described as a blue ribbon jury, a group of Jefferson admirers, including a very able Library of Congress specialist, a retired or a prominent lawyer, family members of Jefferson descendants, a wonderful man who had immigrated to America from Iran seeking religious freedom, who had fallen in love with Jefferson because of his leadership role
Was that
in
Batman?
promoting that. And
Batman?
go ahead.
Was that Batman?
Yes, that was Bahman. Everybody called him
Wow.
Batman because
That's right.
his Iranian name nobody could pronounce. But he actually first approached me about taking part in it, and I wondered what he was smoking. I had read in the newspapers that DNA had proven Jefferson's paternity, and even Monticello, the great champions of everything Jefferson, had conceded the point. And it shocked me. It was so contrary to everything I thought I knew about Thomas Jefferson. But Jefferson was a man of science and would want us to accept scientific proof. And so when he asked if I would take part in a blue ribbon jury of senior scholars, I literally was flabbergasted. And then they told me, did you know they did not even have Thomas Jefferson's DNA for their test? And I'm say, what? It was not what I understood. And so I agreed to take part in it. And then to my shock, a few weeks later, they asked if I would chair it, which I agreed to do. And we had a just tremendous group, a very distinguished group of scholars. And we spent a full
So
year.
let me stop you there. I mean,
Yeah.
you were asked to chair this committee of distinguished scholars, and how were the scholars chosen? That'll take us to the second question, but you're leading into it. So I want to. We have a. And how did this panel differ from the panel at Monticello, for example?
Well, Monticello's panel was an in-house group, mostly non-PhDs. It was chaired by a woman who was working on a PhD and ultimately got it.
Diane
Uh,
Swan Wright.
exactly, and the best educated member of their group was White Mackenzie Wallenborn, a very distinguished Charlottesville physician and adjunct professor at UVA Medical School, and he was the sole dissenter who wrote a vehement dissent. And later helped us as we were working on our report, giving his own thoughts on the issue. It was I was not involved in picking most of the members. They had contacted them before I came along. I was involved in a few, and candidly, one of my goals was to make sure we had people who were not Jefferson fans. I entered the project. I would have disqualified me from a jury just because I had been an admirer of Jefferson and had read his works for half a century. And so Forrest McDonald was a very distinguished professor at University of Alabama and a Hamiltonian Federalist. And I called him and asked if he would join us. And he said, Bob, I should tell you I'm an unreconstructed Hamiltonian Federalist, and I've always been prepared to believe the worst about Thomas Jefferson. And I've known about this story since I was a professor at Brown. And Winthrop Jordan wrote his dissertation, which was later published as a prize-winning book, White Over Black, and had discovered, actually he discovered it from Merle Peters or from Duma Malone, that Jefferson was present at Monticello when all of Sally Hemings' children were conceived, which is not clearly true because in at least one case, he was there less than half of the conception window. But the point they miss is Monticello was kept locked up when Jefferson was in Washington. And so when he came back to Charlottesville, that's when all of his friends and others, came to visit. And so obviously, it's a little bit like saying we've discovered that every time there was a theft at a 7-Eleven store, the owner was present, or the manager, whatever. Well, he was there all the time, so that's not very significant. So anyway, I told Forrest McDonald, a very distinguished professor who had written a quite good book on Jefferson, that first he told me, I've always believed this to be true and don't like Jefferson. And I said, good, you would be particularly important to have in our group because you will counterbalance any pro-Jefferson bias that I bring, to the process. And in the end, he wrote a very short concurring opinion. And he said, I've always assumed this story was true. I've spent a year looking at it. It simply did not happen. And in the end, we started off with 16 scholars. It was a very busy investigation with dozens of emails going back and forth. And several people just said, I can't keep up with it. I've got my teaching to do, and dropped out. But in the end, we had more than a dozen. And with one very mild dissent, we agreed otherwise unanimously the story is almost certainly not true. And we found doctored evidence. We found arguments that simply were false or factual assertions. And we found other things that were easily explained by something other than Jefferson's paternity of Eston-Hemings. And we
Yeah.
found that Monticello had totally gone in the tank, apparently, to get foundation money to build their visitor center.
Now, McDonald actually read and commented on my book, Framing a Legend, and he said something to the effect that people who read this book will be absolutely mortified. He said actually the people who make the claim, pro-paternity claim, should be mortified. Wrote some very, very nice things, passed away since then. But Forrest McDonald was one of the foremost American historians, even if he was an unreconstructed and unapologetic Federalist. He was one of the foremost American scholars in the country in his day. So his opinion certainly carries a lot of weight. And he wasn't, like you said, pro-Jefferson. And he was swayed to that opinion that Jefferson wasn't the father. So, Rich, do you have another question?
Well, actually, I have my own question. I was curious. You said there was a mild dissenter. Could you
Yeah.
comment on that, or should we leave that for another episode?
Well,
Is there much to say?
yeah, Paul Ray is now a professor at Hillsdale College, but he was the chairman of the politics
In
department at
Hillsdale, in
University of
Michigan?
Tulsa.
Yes.
Yeah, he's at
Okay.
Michigan now, but he was the chair of the politics department at University of Tulsa. Was a Rhodes Scholar, a very able scholar, and of course most Rhodes Scholars are. And he was with the majority until the final, I guess, 2 weeks or so. And he called me and basically said, "Look, it probably shouldn't be a unanimous report." And I'm going to mildly dissent. And he
Okay.
wrote he started off, I think it's the first words of his report were, with the majority report, I'm in general agreement. But he went on to say, however, Jefferson is the only one we have reason to believe was there when all of Sally's children were conceived. And therefore, it's slightly more likely he was the father than someone else. And, uh, I had no problem. There were people who wanted us to limit the group that asked us to do this study. I told them we will only do it if we are completely independent. You don't get briefings on what we're doing. They did have one of
Like
their members.
Monticello,
Right.
where they
Uh,
had.
yeah, one of the members of the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society, who passed away a few years later, did serve as a liaison to reserve hotel rooms, help people get airline tickets, and we mentioned Batman, the
Was
Iranian.
that Elf? Was that Elf Map you're talking about?
No, no, this was
Another scholar.
Moffat. This was just a member of the group that asked us to do this. No, Alf was
Okay.
one of the scholars, and Alf was a very distinguished Jefferson historian. He had actually been flown to Paris in 1976 to receive a medal from the French government. They wanted to honor Jefferson at the time of the American bicentennial, and Alf was the guy they picked among Jefferson scholars to bring in and give a talk and then receive a medal. And he was a very decent man and was very active in our group. But anyway, bottom line is most of the people they had were already signed up when they invited me to join the group. And I guess the person I was most active in recruiting was Forrest McDonald, just to make sure we had balance. It was not just a bunch of Jefferson admirers. Several of us entered the project assuming the story to be true. Forrest was one example, but there were others, and that's because we had read in the newspapers that even Monticello has conceded the point, and scientific evidence. And we all saw the O.J. Simpson trial, and we were told that DNA is much more accurate than fingerprints. And Thomas Jefferson's fingerprints were all over Sally Hemings, we were told. And in fact, it wasn't close to being true. And indeed, the scientist the doctor who started the DNA project and oversaw it, I met with him several times, and he told me, Bob, the newspapers have totally misrepresented what we concluded. He said, we didn't have Thomas Jefferson's DNA. Our conclusion was that one of Sally's children, Hemings, her youngest son, was probably fathered by someone carrying the Jefferson Y chromosome, which narrowed it down to more than 24 Jefferson males known to have been in Virginia at the time, and there could have been many more. And thus the odds, based just on the DNA testing, that Thomas Jefferson was Eston's father were about 4%. Or if you exclude people who we had no reason to believe were at Monticello at the time, perhaps 15 or 16%. So this was, I don't think it was evil. I think it was just ignorance. Nature, one of the most respected science journals in the world, rushed the story to press to get it out just before the American election in 1998. And they entitled the story, Jefferson Fathered Slave's Last Child. If they had said A. Jefferson, that would have been an accurate statement. But the way they worded it, it sounded like they were talking about Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
And very few
the only Jefferson that matters.
Yeah. And so they did a horrible injustice to Thomas Jefferson. I literally came away from our year-long study, and I spent hundreds of hours working on this, with the belief that if the legal standard were guilty unless proven innocent beyond reasonable doubt, I would have voted innocent. And I think most members of the jury felt the same way, or the panel felt the same way. We had some of the most distinguished scholars in the country. We had a former chair of the Harvard Government Department, two former presidents of the New England Political Science Association. We had several people who had written books on Jefferson that had been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. It was a really a blue ribbon panel, and if your audience is interested, our book is called "The Jefferson-Hemings Controversy: Report of the Scholars Commission." It's available on Amazon or from Carolina Academic Press.
We'll put a picture of that, Bob. We'll put a picture of your book up at the end of the video.
It's 400 pages with over 1,400 footnotes, and it includes a lot of documents reproduced so you can see the original document. Although Monticello claims that their 30-page report is the definitive study on the issue, that's absurd. We had 13, even the lawyers on our panel also had academic doctorates. I was one of the lawyers. The other lawyer had been Duma Malone's last PhD student. He had gotten a PhD writing about Jefferson. And by the way, I had used his book in my own doctoral dissertation because he wrote a book on Jefferson and the Constitution that was outstanding. And I had done a 1,700-page doctoral dissertation on national security and the Constitution. And I found his book to be extremely valuable. So it was an outstanding group. And Dan Jordan, who was the president.
Let me say something about Duma Malone. He was, for our audience, he was the first Thomas Jefferson Foundation scholar at University of Virginia. And he wrote over, 4 decades, I think 6 volumes on the life of Thomas Jefferson. And any scholar, when people always ask me, I want to start off with Jefferson, my advice is always you start off with Duma Malone. Then you go out
if you read
pre-Jefferson.
serials that are willing to wade through 6 volumes, but you're exactly right. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for that series even before it was completed.
And
And
that's not dated, by the way. Sometimes I do research and I read through the volumes of biographies on Jefferson. I go back to Malone sometimes and find something that everybody has missed, a critical discussion that takes things to a different level. So his stuff is not dated, even though his last volume was decades ago.
yeah,
Anyway, I want to say the geneticist you mentioned was Eugene Foster.
yes.
And when that study came out, other scientists roundly criticized the study. There was a retraction that came to really no effect. The damage had been done.
Yeah, Gene, I found Gene to be an honorable man. He was obviously very liberal. We first met in the one of the Charlottesville restaurants, Red Lobster, and I noticed his Volvo had some very left-wing bumper stickers on it, and he clearly wanted to prove Jefferson was guilty, but I don't think he doctored the evidence or did anything professionally irresponsible. And indeed, after the report was misrepresented in the media, he wrote letters that were published in both Nature, the scientific journal that wrote the original story, and the New York Times, saying we are being misrepresented. We did not say Thomas Jefferson fathered Hemings. We said he was one of more than 24 men who probably was the father. So, I don't blame him. I think he was, I think the Monticello report was an absolute hatchet job. And I think if anyone reads the dissenting opinion of White Mackenzie Wallenborn, Dr. Wallenborn, it becomes very clear. Indeed, a lot of points they made refuted points that Monticello had been agreeing to for decades. If you go back and read their scholarship, they you made one error when you referred to Duma Malone as being the first Thomas Jefferson Foundation professor. He was the first Thomas Jefferson Memorial
That's
Foundation.
right.
And Ken called me, or maybe we talked. I met with Ken several times. He became a good friend. And he told me that he had confronted Dan Jordan, the president of Monticello, and said, you know as well as I do, your report has overstated the case. And they'd been good friends. Dan Jordan was a PhD and very able scholar. And he said, Dan looked at him and in frustration said, you don't have to raise $30 million, or maybe it was 40 million. I don't remember the figure. And Dan was under pressure to raise money for their beautiful new visitor center. And apparently, according to Ken, Dan told him that one big foundation had basically said, we won't give you a penny to memorialize Thomas Jefferson, but if you want to focus your work on slave life at Monticello, we'll give you all the money you're asking for. And Dan needed to have his visitor center. So Ken said he basically threw in the towel. And a few months, or maybe it was weeks later, I read in the local paper that Monticello had changed their name. They were originally founded as the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, and then they became the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. And indeed, a graduate history student from UVA, when he read about our ongoing study in the student newspaper, came to my office in the law school and said he had been a tour guide at Monticello and had been called on the carpet. They put a ringer in one of his tours to see what he was saying, and they called him on the carpet and told him, we are no longer in the business of memorializing Thomas Jefferson. Tone down your praise. And he was pretty unhappy with that because he really admired Jefferson. But
you're talking about one of the world's great intellects of the time. I mean, the world's. I mean, I've studied all aspects of his mind.
Of all time.
I'm astonished that we have to sit here and defend him from charges of racism when there's so many other things we should be examining about his mind.
Yeah, I have often said that Thomas Jefferson was a racist because he wrote some remarks in his notes on the state of Virginia that certainly suggested he didn't think that African slaves were as intellectually talented as other groups and so forth. but he was at worst, he was a reluctant racist. He repeatedly said, listen, he was writing a scientific treatise, and he said, listen, what I have observed is based upon a very limited sampling, and everything I have observed might be explained by their circumstances. They're held in bondage. They're not allowed to have a
Yes.
serious education and so forth. And he said, no one would be happier than I would to see all of these negative comments refuted in the future. And he very importantly, in a letter to French scholar, and you're going to have to help me because I'm drawing a total blank, but he wrote, uh, I've often speculated that blacks may not be as intelligent as whites, but whatever their intellect, it is no measure of their rights. We don't
That's
make
right.
Sir Isaac Newton the master of the lives or property of others because he's smarter than they are.
That's
And
right.
Jefferson was a rare person in that era to believe that blacks ought to have rights. When he said all men are created equal, he included blacks, whites, and every other group. And we've lost that. Indeed, having read everything Lincoln published, I would say Jefferson's record on attitude towards blacks was much more enlightened than Lincoln's. Although Lincoln gets all the credit for freeing the slaves, which, of course, in fact, he didn't do. What he did do was issue a proclamation saying that the slaves that are no longer under my control because their states have seceded from the Union, they're all now free. Ha, ha, ha.
During the middle of the war.
Yeah, which
But
was
anyways, Jefferson on
a different
slavery, you mentioned that. It follows from this is where the philosophical dimension comes in, because consistent with the empiricists like Adam Smith, David Hume, Lord Bolingbroke, he thought human intellection differed from human to human. Only a very few were were superbly intelligent. Most people weren't. But he did recognize, and no one seems to notice this for some reason, all human beings, black people included, are morally equivalent and consistent with people like David Hume and Keynes. The moral dimension of human personality is much more important than the intellectual, because all people have the same capacity for morally correct action. And he makes that concession
that's
in
key. His letter, if people are looking for a wonderful letter to guide their own children, Jefferson wrote a letter to Peter Carr, his probably his favorite nephew, and his basic message was, as you address moral issues, follow the truth wherever it will lead you, no matter what anyone else thinks. And he said that our moral sense is as much a part of our built-in character as our arms and legs. State a moral proposition to a professor and a plowman, and the latter will get it right as often, nay, perhaps more often
more
than the
often.
former, not being
Yeah.
led astray by artificial considerations. It's just a wonderful letter. And he said, we all know what is right and wrong. And
Right. The
uh,
artificial considerations were reading books on morality where people have conflicting views on how we come to moral judgments. For Jefferson, it was sensed, it was felt, it wasn't reasoned through. So that's important to understand. And all human beings had equally the capacity, with few exceptions like Napoleon, he thought, people who were just monsters at birth, for moral correct action. And that was the predominant criterion by which he judged people, whether you are acting according to your moral sense.
yeah.
And
In fact,
intellection could very easily corrupt you.
One of my favorite lines in that letter is, you are answerable for the what was it, for the not the rightness of your conclusions, but the righteousness of your, basically you're answerable for the integrity with which you try to find
Right.
answers to questions rather than whether you actually get the right answer. And
Mhm.
he as I mentioned, I first got hooked on Jefferson when I just started reading his letters, and they were just so eloquently written, but also so brilliantly reasoned, that I became hooked. I wrote the first English language history of Vietnamese communism back in the early 1970s, and I remembered an essay that Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam, and Secretary General of their Communist Party, had written about somebody giving him a book by Lenin, and reading it alone in his hotel room and wanting to scream out, "Compatriots, this is the answer to our struggle for freedom." And I had exactly, I was actually working on that book when I was reading Jefferson, and I said, "I understand how Ho Chi Minh felt, except I got the good guy and he got the monster." By the way, when you speak about monsters, you don't have to go back to Napoleon. You can talk about Vladimir Putin as well, but that's
That's another
another session.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson just, he literally thought the moral sense was given to all people, just like faculty of eyes, of hearing and
Yeah,
seeing. But he recognized some people are born blind, and he really conceded that some people were born without moral sensibility. And he thought, the more he studied Napoleon, he realized that Napoleon didn't have a moral sense. I'm not a moral sense theorist, but I'm just trying to have our audience understand that. All right, we have about what do we have? About 7 minutes left. We have not gone into, Rich, I'll have you ask the last question. We have not gone into the nuts and bolts of your findings. We'll have to do that for another show. We'll have you on several times. But I just want to talk about the overall reception. You want to give us the last question?
Yes. So what, Professor Turner, is, in your opinion, was the overall reception of your book? You kind of hinted at it, but maybe it could be a little bit more detailed.
yeah. There are two phases to this. Perhaps I should explain. Our report came out on April 12th, 2001, and our book came out in 2012. And the reason is my day job was national security law. When 911 came along, all of a sudden, I literally was spending more than 2 nights a week out of town for 6 months, attending conferences, giving lectures, and so forth. And I called our publisher about a week after the 911 attack, and I said the book's going to be late. I'd promised it to them in November, and it took me until 2012 to catch up and get it published. And when the initial report came out, we got very lucky. Monticello apparently called from the beginning. I had been in touch with the Monticello Association, which is the family group of descendants of Thomas Jefferson, who, among other things, own the graveyard at Monticello, and also the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, and telling them, here's where we stand. I've got questions for you about this, whatever. And then when our report was finished, I emailed a copy to both groups. We're going to release this on the afternoon. We had reserved a room at the National Press Club. I think it was 2 o'clock on April 12th, 2001. And the reason I chose that time is because April 13th is Thomas Jefferson's birthday. And I thought if we released it a day early, perhaps some editorial writers would do an editorial on honoring Jefferson's birthday the next day and mention our report. Well, turns out, apparently Monticello contacted the White House and suggested, why don't you have a gathering of Jefferson's white and black descendants at the White House at 2 o'clock on April 12th? Now, why you wouldn't do it on Jefferson's birthday is a little bit bizarre, unless you wanted to draw the press away from our press conference over to the White House meeting. And the thing they didn't calculate is the press generally didn't like George W. Bush very much. And thus, they loved writing stories while George W. Bush was hosting the Hemings descendants and the Jefferson descendants at the White House. A group of distinguished scholars across town was disclosing that the Hemings weren't really Jefferson's kids. It was a wonderful dig at him. And so we had a much bigger turnout for our press conference and got much more publicity. And by my count, every major newspaper in the country did a story on it, with two exceptions, the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I later wrote two articles in the Wall Street Journal providing even more detail on it. So they were covered. The LA Times, I think, never covered it. But so we got tremendous coverage. CNN ran their story on our report for 24 hours. Usually they run a story for a few cycles and then drop it. And so we got incredibly good coverage. But then when our book came out, it was the opposite. we got almost no, it was almost as if there was a conspiracy saying, don't mention this book. My thought was that one advantage of waiting 11 years to bring out the book is it might be a new story. If we had brought it out a month after the report, they'd say, well, we covered this last month. But I found one review, I believe it was in the William and Mary Quarterly, uh, that reviewed our book along with several other books, and we got a paragraph or two, but otherwise no one touched it. One of the main historical journals had said the disclosure that Jefferson had fathered children by the enslaved Sally Hemings is the most important development in Jefferson scholarship in half a century. And yet they didn't even mention the fact that a group of distinguished scholars had looked at it and realized it was not true. And we just, we wrote a 400-page book with over 1,400 footnotes to original sources mostly, and just decimated the case against Jefferson. But it has been totally ignored by professional historians. And our sole dissenter, Paul Ray, called me a few weeks after our report came out and said that he was actively involved with the American Political Science Association and thought it might be fun to set up a debate on this issue for their 2002 annual meeting. And would I be willing to participate? And I said, I'll not only participate, I'll pay my own way. Just tell me when and where. And about 6 weeks later, he called back and said, Bob, I've talked to Annette Gordon-Reed, Joe Ellis, Peter Onuff, most of the really top
Professor Turner.
And he said none of them will debate. They've all moved on to other issues. So there's never been a debate. Go ahead.
There's that. I know we're running out of time, but there's that whole thing where we're moved on. Peter Onuff, we moved on to other issues.
Yeah.
They would get destroyed in a debate. They know it. And they know what they're doing is bullshit. I'm convinced of that. They're doing it for political reasons. Rich?
Yes, I wanted to thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's been awesome listening to both of you talk about this current history, about our 200-year-old history. I did want to say that we are welcome to come on and do more shows in the future. This was a wonderful introduction, and one of the focuses of this show is to draw attention to important work such as yours and others who are unfolding the conspiracy that's happened at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation.
Okay, thank you, Bob.